Madame Serwaa forced me to kneel on raw, fermented cocoa beans in the pouring rain, laughing as the sharp edges cut into my bare knees. She told me I was nothing but a worthless maid who would die in the dirt. What she didn't know was that the very estate she stood on, the beans I knelt on, and the millions in her offshore accounts all legally belonged to me. My name is Amma, and this is how I let my cruel madam dig her own grave. Amma knelt on the jagged fermented cocoa beans, the midnight rain of Accra lashing against her skin like 1,000 liquid whips. She did not scream, she did not beg. She had learned, over the 11 agonizing months she had lived under Serwaa's roof, that screaming only fed the woman's hunger for absolute control. What Serwaa did not know, what the self-proclaimed queen of the Gold Coast cocoa empire would not learn for another 21 days, was that the woman she had just thrown into the storm was the sole legal heir to the process. Entire Obuasi fortune. The rain tasted of salt and ancient dust, washing over the raw, sharp edges of the beans that bit into Amma's knees. But the physical pain was a distant, secondary noise to the cold, structural fury assembling itself in her chest. The courtyard of the cantonment's mansion was a theater of sensory contradictions. To Amma's left, the sprawling glass walls of the main villa glowed with a soft, expensive amber light, smelling faintly of leather, cold air conditioning, and imported lilies. To her right, the mud-plastered walls of the servant quarters emitted the heavy, stale scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and fermented cassava. She existed in the fracture between these two worlds, a ghost in an Ankara dress, observing the mechanics of a house that was built on her own stolen legacy. The rain intensified, turning the red dust of the yard into a thick, suffocating paste that clung to her ankles, a physical weight that mirrored the psychological burden she had carried since she first stepped through these gates. The heavy mahogany door of the villa creaked open, casting a long, sharp shadow across the wet pavement. Serwaa stood on the threshold, her silhouette framed by the golden warmth of the interior. She was draped in a silk robe the color of a bruised plum, her hair perfectly coiffed even at this hour, her presence exuding the sharp, metallic chill of a woman who viewed human empathy as a technical weakness. She did not look at the storm. She looked only at the kneeling figure of Amma and the small, shivering child tucked beneath her arm. The sight of Serwaa triggered an immediate psychological autopsy within Amma's mind. She observed the way the woman held her teacup fingers arched, pinky extended, a practiced affectation of a class she had married into, but never truly understood. Serwaa's cruelty was not a sudden explosion of temper. It was a curated, administrative process. She did not strike because she was angry. She struck because she felt the silence of the house needed to be recalibrated. For Serwaa, power was a zero-sum game played out in the small, domestic humiliations of those she deemed beneath her. She viewed Amma not as a human being with a history, but as a decorative piece of infrastructure that had failed to function correctly. This realization did not wound Amma. It provided her with a map. When you know exactly how a person values others, you know exactly how to devalue them when the time comes. "The beans are still there, Amma," Serwaa said, her voice smooth and devoid of any maternal resonance. "I told you 3 times that the raw stock was not to be left in the open. Now, they are wet. Their value is diminished, just like your position in this house." Amma did not look up. She felt the child, Ya, tremble against her side. His heartbeat was a rapid, frantic drumming against her ribs, a somatic marker of a fear so deep it had moved into his bone marrow. The smell of his terror was specific, the sour scent of cold sweat and unwashed hair. He was 7 years old, the grandson of a man who had built kingdoms, yet he was being forced to quivering on the ground because a woman with a silk robe felt a momentary dip in her sense of dominance. The word Serwaa spoke landed on an old, hardened bruise in Amma's psyche, the memory of her own father's voice, the night he was cast out of this same empire. He had told her that wealth was not the gold in the ground, but the ability to remain still while the world burned around you. Amma was remaining still. She was absorbing the cold, the rain, and the insult, treating them as data points in a larger equation. She understood that every minute she spent on her knees was a minute she was earning the right to eventually stand over Serwaa's ruin. Silence was not her surrender, it was her strategy. "I am sorry, madam," Amma whispered, her voice a perfect imitation of a broken spirit. Behind Serwaa, in the dim light of the hallway, a second figure appeared. Kwame, the boy's father and the acting chief executive officer of Gold Coast Cocoa, stood in the shadows. He was dressed in a tailored Italian suit that looked strangely hollow on his frame, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide their trembling. He did not step forward. He did not shout for the boy to be brought inside. He stood in the atmospheric chill of the hallway, his gaze dropping to the polished marble floor between his shoes. The sight of Kwame required a different kind of autopsy. Amma dissected the mechanics of his cowardice with the precision of a surgeon. He was a man who had traded his son's safety for the preservation of his corporate title. The blood had left his face, leaving it a sallow, sickly gray in the yellow light. He was suffering from a cognitive collapse, a paralysis born from the knowledge that Serwaa held the keys to his undoing. He knew about the grain, he knew about the rain, and he knew his son was freezing. But his attachment to his pedigree was a leash that Serwaa pulled with effortless grace. He was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was an enabler whose silence was more destructive than any physical blow. Amma watched as Kwame's eyes flickered toward his son for a microsecond before darting away. He was experiencing a somatic rejection of his own reality. His throat tightened until swallowing felt like forcing down a stone, a physical manifestation of the words he was refusing to say. He was a prisoner in a mansion he technically owned, a man who had allowed his home to become a panopticon, where his every move was judged by a woman who had no legal claim to the throne he sat upon. "Kwame, tell her," Serwaa said, not turning around. "Tell her what happens to servants who neglect the harvest." Kwame's jaw locked. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple despite the cool air of the house. He took a breath, but it was shallow, catching in his chest. She must learn, Amma. The rules are the rules. The betrayal was complete. The father had endorsed the torment of the son. Amma felt the child flinch at the sound of his father's voice, a movement so subtle it was almost invisible, but to Amma, it felt like an earthquake. The child's heartbeat moved into his ears, a frantic thrumming that she could feel through his wet shirt. This was the moment Act 1 reached its emotional apex, the total isolation of the protagonist and the victim. What Serwaa and Kwame could not have known was that Amma was not just holding a child. She was holding a mental record of this entire exchange. She was documenting the exact tone of Kwame's voice, the specific arch of Serwaa's eyebrow, and the sensory details of the rain. She was building a case that would be delivered not in a court of law, but in the boardroom of the empire. The rain began to slacken, the heavy drumming on the corrugated roof of the servant quarters fading into a rhythmic, mocking drip. Serwaa took a final sip of her tea and turned back into the warmth of the house. "You will stay there until the moon sets, Amma. Perhaps the cold will sharpen your memory." The heavy mahogany door swung shut. The lock clicked a sharp, mechanical sound that echoed through the empty courtyard like a gunshot. The golden light disappeared, leaving Amma and Ya in the absolute, crushing darkness of the Accra night. Amma did not move. She waited for the sound of Serwaa's heels to fade into the depths of the mansion. She waited until the only sound left was the distant Okada horns and the rustle of the palm trees in the wind. Then, and only then, did she allow her composure to shift. She did not cry. Crying was for the weak. Instead, she leaned down and whispered into Ya's ear, her voice no longer the voice of a servant, but the voice of a sovereign. "They think they have locked us out, Ya," she whispered, "but they have actually locked themselves in. They have turned this house into a cage, and they are the ones without the key. Ya looked up at her, his eyes wide and glassy in the dark. "Are we going to die, Auntie Amma?" "No," Amma said, her jaw tightening. "We are going to wait. And while we wait, we are going to remember every second of this. Because when the sun rises, the story is going to change." She stood up slowly, her knees cracking from the cold, the fermented cocoa beans falling from her skin like discarded scales. She carried the boy toward the servant quarters, her feet bare on the red mud, her heart a cold ticking clock. Act 1 was over. The trap had been set, the vulnerability established, and the irony dropped. The audience now knew what the villains did, not that the woman in the rain was the storm that was coming for them. Days slowly turned into weeks, and the heavy coastal rains of Accra gave way to the dry, abrasive winds of the Harmattan season. The atmosphere across the city transformed into a hazy, pale yellow, the air thick with fine white dust blown down from the Sahara. This dust coated the corrugated tin roofs of the servant quarters in a chalky film, settling into the cracks of the mud walls and leaving a permanent, dry taste of earth on the back of the tongue. Inside the cantonment's mansion, however, the climate remained a manufactured paradise. Massive industrial air conditioning units purred endlessly, filtering out the continent entirely. The interior maintained a crisp, unnatural chill that smelled of imported lavender, lemon wax, and the cold metallic scent of polished silver. The wealth of the house was designed to insulate its inhabitants from reality, creating a sealed terrarium where power could be exercised without the interference of the outside world. Amma navigated this jarring division of atmospheres every day, moving from the suffocating heat of the outdoor processing shed to the freezing corridors of the main house. Her existence had become an exercise in calculated endurance. The incident in the rain was not an isolated event. It was merely the prologue to a sustained campaign of psychological and physical dismantling. Serwaa had realized that Amma possessed a quiet, unbreakable dignity, and for a woman whose entire identity was constructed on the subjugation of others, that dignity was an intolerable offense. To break it, Serwaa systematically attacked the only thing Amma appeared to value: her connection to the boy, Ya, and her reliance on the meager wages that supposedly kept her alive. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the rooftops, Serwaa implemented a new directive. She stood on the marble veranda, a cup of imported espresso in her manicured hands, looking down at the dusty courtyard. She informed Amma that her duties as a nanny were no longer sufficient to justify her presence. Before she was allowed to prepare Ya for his tutors, Amma was now required to manually sort the daily delivery of roasted cocoa beans in the unventilated tin shed at the edge of the property. It was grueling, manual labor typically reserved for the lowest tier of factory workers, performed in an enclosed space where the temperature frequently exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. The command was not born of necessity. The Gold Coast cocoa empire employed thousands of workers in highly mechanized facilities across the region. Bringing raw, roasted beans to a residential mansion for manual sorting was an intentional, theatrical display of cruelty. Serwaa wanted Amma smelling of sweat, smoke, and bitter chocolate when she walked into the pristine house. She wanted the boundary between employer and servant to be olfactory as well as financial. It was a direct attack on Amma's pedigree and class, a daily reminder that her physical body belonged to the machinery of the estate. Amma accepted the order without a single word of protest. She tied a faded cotton cloth around her head, walked into the stifling heat of the shed, and began the back-breaking work of sifting through the heavy burlap sacks. The rough fibers tore at the skin of her hands, and the acidic smoke of the roasting process stung her eyes, but her breathing remained deep and metered. She did not view the labor as a humiliation. She viewed it as intelligence gathering. Every bean she sorted was a physical piece of the empire she legally owned. She allowed the heat to bake into her muscles, cataloging the exact nature of Serwaa's malice, building a forensic profile of a woman who was digging her own grave with diamond-encrusted shovels. Later that evening, after 3 weeks of this exhausting routine, the psychological warfare escalated from the physical to the emotional. Amma was in the kitchen, washing the soot from her forearms with cold water from the deep aluminum sink when Serwaa entered. The madam of the house glided across the Italian tile floor, her heels clicking in a sharp, rhythmic cadence that usually signaled impending consequence. Serwaa paused near the center island, running a single finger over the immaculate granite surface to check for dust that did not exist. "You look exhausted, Amma," Serwaa said, her voice carrying a deceptive, sugary lightness. "Your people have always worked the dirt, but I suppose even beasts of burden have their breaking points. Every thread on your back is bought with my money. Remember that the next time you look at my stepson with that pathetic, maternal affection." The words were designed to sever the emotional bond between the caregiver and the child, attacking the profound attachment wound of poverty and dependence. Serwaa recognized that Yah sought comfort in the servant rather than the stepmother, and instead of questioning her own lack of warmth, she chose to penalize the source of his comfort. She framed Amma's capacity for love as a transaction, an overstepping of class boundaries that needed to be violently corrected. The insult was meant to remind Amma that she was entirely replaceable, a temporary fixture whose survival was entirely dependent on the erratic mercy of the wealthy. This verbal assault required an immediate psychological autopsy. Serwaa's need to vocalize her superiority was a symptom of a profound internal rot. Wealthy people who are secure in their power rarely feel the need to explain it to the people sweeping their floors. Serwaa's constant reminders of her financial dominance were, in reality, confessions of her own insecurity. She had married into the Obuasi fortune. She had not built it. She was terrified that the architecture of her life was fundamentally hollow. By degrading a woman she perceived as powerless, Serwaa was attempting to inject substance into her own fragile identity. The cruelty was not a sign of strength. It was a desperately loud alarm bell signaling an impending structural collapse. Amma did not flinch, her jaw locked, a single vein pulsing steadily at her temple. She dried her hands on a coarse linen towel, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked directly into Serwaa's eyes, refusing to lower her gaze to the floor as the other servants did. "I hear you the first time, madam," Amma said, her voice as flat and unyielding as the granite countertop. She allowed Serwaa to bask in the illusion of victory. It cost her nothing. What Serwaa could not have known, standing there in her expensive silk blouse, was that the concept of dependence was entirely reversed. Amma thought of the heavy, leather-bound ledger resting in a private safety deposit box at the Zenith Global Industries Bank in the center of the city. That ledger contained the original founder's shares, the voting rights, and the irrevocable trust documents that rendered Serwaa's marriage to Kwame a legally insignificant footnote in the corporate hierarchy. Serwaa believed she owned the heir. Amma breathed. The truth was securely locked behind 6 inches of reinforced steel, waiting for the precise moment of maximum devastation. The true depth of the sustained wound arrived 3 days later, orchestrated in the formal dining room, a cavernous space dominated by a massive mahogany table that could seat 30 people. The room was fiercely air-conditioned, the tall windows draped in heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the brutal afternoon sun. Kwame sat at the far end of the table, an untouched glass of whiskey resting near his right hand. His posture was curled inward, his eyes fixed on the intricate grain of the wood. Serwaa stood at the head of the table, holding a sleek leather folder. She had summoned Amma to serve water, but the silver pitcher was merely an excuse to guarantee an audience for the execution she was about to perform. Yah was seated next to his father, his small feet dangling inches above the thick wool carpet. He looked terrified, his shoulders hiked up toward his ears, his breathing shallow and rapid. He knew the temperature of this room. He knew that when Serwaa held a folder, someone was about to disappear. "I have made a decision regarding the boy's education," Serwaa announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The private tutors are clearly failing to instill any sense of discipline or acceptable behavior. He is soft. He cowers. He spends too much time lingering in the servant quarters, picking up the habits of the destitute. Kwame's head snapped up. The blood left his face, his hands beginning to tremble so violently he had to press them flat against the tabletop to hide the movement. Serwaa, he is 7 years old. We agreed the local international school was sufficient. We agreed to nothing, Kwame, Serwaa corrected sharply, her tone dropping in temperature. She opened the leather folder and slid a stack of heavily redacted financial documents across the polished mahogany. They stopped exactly an inch from his empty glass. I tolerate your presence in this house because it is currently convenient for the board of directors. But do not confuse your title with actual authority. Look at the papers, Kwame. Look at the supply chain deficits from last October. The room went entirely silent. The heavy hum of the air conditioning seemed to amplify the sound of Kwame swallowing. He did not need to look at the papers. He knew exactly what they contained. It was the doctored evidence of his desperate attempt to cover a massive corporate shortfall by moving funds through illicit offshore channels. It was the absolute leverage she held over his life. I have enrolled him in the St. Jude Disciplinary Academy in Tamale, Serwaa continued, her voice practically glowing with satisfaction. It is a boarding facility in the northern region. They specialize in breaking stubborn children and rebuilding them. They do not allow family visitation for the first 6 months. He leaves on Friday. A cold, heavy dread materialized in the room. Tamale was hundreds of kilometers away, a harsh, unforgiving environment that would swallow a sensitive child like Ya whole. It was not a school, it was an exile. It was the ultimate punishment for Kwame's financial sins enacted upon the body of his child. Kwame's reaction was a masterclass in psychological defeat. Something cold opened in his chest and refused to close. His gaze dropped back to the mahogany between his hands. He could taste copper at the back of his throat. The instinct to protect his son violently collided with the terror of a prison sentence and total public disgrace. He was a man drowning in a shallow pool, refusing to stand up because he was too ashamed of the water. He said nothing. The silence of a father abandoning his child is the loudest sound in the world. "Father, please," Ya whispered, his voice cracking. He reached out a small, trembling hand toward Kwame's sleeve. "I will be good. I will not go to the kitchen anymore. Please do not send me away." Kwame closed his eyes. He slowly, deliberately pulled his arm away from his son's grasp. The psychological autopsy of Kwame's withdrawal revealed the ultimate failure of the patriarch. He had convinced himself that staying out of prison was the only way to eventually protect his son, a twisted logic born of cowardice and self-preservation. By pulling his arm away, he was severing the final thread of parental attachment, sacrificing the boy on the altar of his own reputation. He believed he was surviving. In truth, he was dying a slow, invisible death of character. Some betrayals leave physical scars, others completely dissolve the internal architecture of a human being, leaving nothing but a hollow shell wearing an expensive suit. Serwaa watched the exchange with an expression of profound satisfaction, but the cruelty was not yet complete. She turned her gaze toward Amma, who was standing near the sideboard, the silver pitcher of water still gripped in her hands. "You look disturbed, Amma," Serwaa noted smoothly. "Do you disagree with my assessment of the boy's needs?" Amma did not move. Her breathing did not change. "It is not my place to agree or disagree, madam. I am here to pour the water." "Exactly," Serwaa smiled, a thin, razor-like curvature of her lips. "And because you understand your place so perfectly, you will be the one to pack his bags. You will gather his things, you will put them in the trunk of the car on Friday morning, and you will explain to him that this is for his own good. If you shed a single tear, if you offer him a single word of false hope, I will contact the authorities and inform them that I have discovered 3 of my diamond earrings missing from my vanity." The police in Accra are not known for their gentle treatment of thieving servants. The threat was absolute. It was the deepest humiliation of the arc. Serwaa was not just taking the child away. She was forcing Amma to act as the instrument of his removal. She was weaponizing Amma's poverty and lack of legal standing, creating a scenario where attempting to comfort the child would result in her own imprisonment. It was a sustained, specific cruelty designed to completely break the spirit of the caregiver, forcing her to participate in the trauma of the person she loved most. The audience watched the engine of Serwaa's malice reach its peak efficiency. She had outmaneuvered the father and paralyzed the protector. She stood at the head of the table, bathed in the cold light of the chandelier, a sovereign of absolute terror. She believed she had won. Amma's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of the silver pitcher. She looked at Ya, whose small face was completely devoid of hope, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. She looked at Kwame, who was staring at the floor, a broken, useless man. And finally, she looked at Serwaa. "I understand the instructions perfectly, madam," Amma said, her voice carrying the glacial stillness of a frozen lake. "I will ensure that everything is packed exactly as it should be, and I will make sure he understands exactly who is responsible for his departure." The words carried a dual meaning that completely bypassed Serwaa's arrogant radar. The villain heard compliance. The audience heard a promise of absolute impending annihilation. Act 2 concluded not with a scream of defiance, but with the quiet, terrifying sound of a trap snapping shut in the dark. The wound had been sustained, the cruelty absorbed, and the time for endurance was officially over. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the rooftops of the cantonment's estate, the air was already thick with the chalky dust of the Harmattan wind. Amma knelt on the concrete floor of her small, windowless room, an old, scuffed canvas duffel bag open before her. The space smelled of cheap carbolic soap, old dampness, and the metallic tang of the tin roof cooling from the night. Beside her, Ya stood perfectly still, his small hands clutching the hem of his uniform shirt. He was not crying. The capacity for tears had been systematically extracted from him over the past 72 hours. He watched as Amma folded his stiff cotton trousers, smoothing the fabric with a slow, deliberate precision. She did not offer him false comfort. She did not tell him that Tamale would be a grand adventure, or that his father would suddenly ride to his rescue. To lie to a child in the face of absolute exile was a betrayal she refused to commit. Instead, she tucked a small, smoothly polished stone from the courtyard into the bottom of his shoe, an anchor to the earth of his ancestors. She looked at him, her dark eyes completely dry, her posture a monument of quiet endurance. "You will count the days, Ya," Amma said, her voice a low, steady hum that barely disturbed the dust in the air. "You will eat what they give you. You will not answer back to the masters. You will become invisible. And when you reach the 21st day, you will pack this bag exactly as I am packing it now." Ya swallowed heavily. "Why the 21st day, Auntie Amma?" "Because that is the day the shadows burn away," she replied simply. The psychological autopsy of this exchange revealed the fundamental difference between survival and surrender. Amma was not preparing the boy to endure a lifetime of misery. She was giving him a specific, tactical timeline. By establishing a definite endpoint, she transformed his impending exile from a state of hopeless abandonment into a temporary mission. She recognized that children can survive catastrophic psychological trauma if they are armed with a definitive boundary. She was not just packing his clothes. She was outfitting his mind with the architectural blueprints of hope. By midday, the black, heavily armored sport utility vehicle arrived in the driveway to transport the boy. The tires crunched sharply against the gravel, a violent, industrial sound that shattered the quiet of the estate. Kwame remained locked inside his private study, the heavy oak door shut against the reality of his own failure. Serwaa stood on the upper balcony, dressed in a flowing silk kaftan, watching the departure with the serene, detached interest of a monarch observing the removal of a pest. Amma stood by the open trunk, placing the duffel bag inside. The driver, a heavily muscled man with a face like a closed fist, did not look at her. Ya climbed into the back seat, his small frame swallowed by the expansive beige leather interior. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing him in a climate-controlled vault of isolation. The engine roared, and the vehicle glided out of the wrought iron gates, disappearing into the chaotic, exhaust-choked traffic of Accra. From the balcony, Serwaa exhaled a slow, triumphant breath. She believed she had surgically removed the final complication from her life. The psychological autopsy of her satisfaction exposed a profound structural delusion. Serwaa equated the absence of resistance with absolute security. By banishing the boy, she thought she had eliminated the only piece of leverage that could be used against her. She failed to understand that a hostage situation only works when the hostage is present. By removing Ya from the immediate blast radius, Serwaa had inadvertently untied Amma's hands. The villain had secured her own perimeter by sending the protagonist's only vulnerability 300 kilometers away. It was a catastrophic strategic error, born entirely of arrogance. With the boy gone, the atmosphere of the house underwent a chilling transformation. The subtle, underlying tension of a child walking on eggshells was replaced by the cold, sterile hum of a corporate headquarters operating efficiently. Serwaa threw herself into the preparations for the upcoming stakeholders' gala, transforming the mansion into a staging ground for her grandest theatrical performance. Caterers carrying silver trays marched through the hallways. Florists arranged massive displays of imported orchids that smelled faintly of vanilla and chemicals. Tailors arrived with swaths of raw silk and imported Italian velvet. Amma faded into the background, becoming a seamless extension of the architecture. She swept the marble floors until they gleamed like wet ice. She polished the crystal chandeliers until they threw fractured rainbows across the walls. She moved silently, her head bowed, her eyes cast downward. But behind the mask of total subjugation, the engine of her reclamation was running at maximum capacity. The following Tuesday afternoon, the gathering of power moved from the conceptual to the physical. Serwaa had left the estate for a final dress fitting. Leaving the door to her private home office unlocked a rare oversight born of her escalating hubris. Amma entered the room carrying a feather duster and a bottle of lemon polish. The office smelled of ozone from the heavy-duty paper shredder, expensive leather bindings, and the sharp chemical tang of fresh printer ink. Amma did not touch the desk. She moved directly to the sleek, stainless steel wastebasket tucked beneath the mahogany credenza. Serwaa, in her rush to finalize the gala budget, had discarded several misprinted pages of a banking ledger. Amma carefully extracted the crumpled sheets, smoothing them flat against her apron. Her eyes scanned the columns of numbers, tracing the systematic bleeding of the Gold Coast cocoa accounts into a constellation of untraceable shell corporations registered in the Seychelles. The psychological autopsy of this moment highlighted the fatal flaw of the modern financial criminal, the belief that manual laborers cannot read balance sheets. Serwaa operated under the deeply ingrained prejudice that a woman who scrubbed toilets could not possibly comprehend the mechanics of offshore tax evasion. She viewed her financial crimes as existing in a stratosphere far above the intellect of a servant. Amma, however, possessed a degree in forensic accounting, a detail completely erased by the dirt on her knees and the tribal scarf wrapped around her head. She did not just read the numbers, she memorized the routing codes. Every stolen cedi was a nail. Amma silently drove into the coffin of Serwaa's freedom. 2 days later, the mechanism of the secondary twist was quietly slotted into place. The heavy wrought iron gates of the estate swung open to admit a silver luxury sedan. Out stepped Mr. Osei, the senior corporate counsel for Gold Coast Cocoa. He was a man in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, carrying a battered leather briefcase that looked older than the company itself. He was known throughout Accra as a ruthless, pragmatic legal mind, the architect of the empire's ironclad contracts. Serwaa had spent the last 2 years carefully cultivating his loyalty, plying him with expensive scotch, exclusive club memberships, and promises of exorbitant bonuses once she fully secured Kwame's assets. Mr. Osei walked into the grand parlor, his leather shoes clicking against the marble. Serwaa descended the grand staircase to greet him, her smile wide and perfectly rehearsed. Kwame trailed behind her, a silent, hollowed-out shadow. "Mr. Osei, how wonderful of you to come personally," Serwaa cooed, gesturing for him to take a seat on the white linen sofa. "I assume you have the final authorizations for the liquidation of the transport subsidiary? I need those funds cleared before the gala on Friday." "The documents are fully prepared, madam," Mr. Osei replied, his voice a gravelly, resonant baritone. He opened his briefcase and laid the thick stack of papers on the glass coffee table. "Once, Mr. Osei, Kwame signs these, the subsidiary will be dissolved, and the capital will be transferred to your specified holding accounts. It is a highly irregular maneuver, but it is legally sound." Kwame stared at the papers. His throat tightened until swallowing felt like forcing down a stone. Liquidating the transport subsidiary meant firing 300 loyal drivers, men who had worked for his father. But the weight of Serwaa's blackmail pressed against his windpipe. He reached for the gold-plated fountain pen, his hand trembling so violently he nearly dropped it. He signed his name, effectively signing away the last shred of his moral dignity. "Excellent," Serwaa beamed, snatching the papers before the ink was fully dry. "You are an invaluable asset to this family, Mr. Osei. Your loyalty will be rewarded." "I have always served the true interests of this company, madam," Mr. Osei said smoothly, offering a polite, practiced bow of his head. The psychological autopsy of Serwaa's triumph exposed the blindness of transactional relationships. She believed that loyalty was a commodity that could be purchased, entirely failing to recognize that a man who can be bought can also be quietly rebought by a higher, hidden power. She heard Mr. Osei's words and assumed he meant her interests. She did not understand the precise, legal terminology he employed. He said he served the true interests of the company, not the current occupants of the mansion. Later that evening, long after the house had gone quiet, the truth of Mr. Osei's loyalty was revealed in the suffocating darkness of the servant quarters. Amma sat on the edge of her narrow cot, the single exposed light bulb casting long, distorted shadows against the mud walls. The door clicked open silently. Mr. Osei stepped into the cramped room, the crisp tailoring of his suit jarringly out of place against the poverty of the surroundings. He did not look around with disgust. He looked at Amma with a profound, solemn reverence. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a small, encrypted flash drive, placing it gently into Amma's calloused palm. "The offshore transfers she executed this afternoon crossed the threshold, Amma," Mr. Osei whispered, his gravelly voice dropping to a near-silent frequency. "By forcing Kwame to liquidate the transport division to fund her personal accounts, she triggered the embezzlement clause in your grandfather's original trust. Kwame's proxy is legally nullified as of 3 hours ago. The transfer of power is complete." What Serwaa could not have known, what even the audience had not fully grasped until this exact moment, was the true identity of the architect behind her impending ruin. Mr. Osei was not just a corporate lawyer. He was Amma's godfather, the man who had stood beside the late founder of Gold Coast Cocoa when the first seed was planted in the earth. He had spent the last 11 months playing the role of the corrupt, pliable attorney, carefully guiding Serwaa into committing crimes so explicit, so undeniable, that no court in West Africa could ever unravel the trap. He was the invisible hand moving the pieces across the board while Amma absorbed the damage on the front lines. "Is the paperwork filed with the High Court?" Amma asked, her voice steady, devoid of any celebratory inflection. "Sealed and secured in the judge's chambers," Mr. Osei confirmed. "The injunctions are drawn. The freeze on her accounts will execute automatically at 9 o'clock tomorrow evening, precisely when the gala begins. The psychological autopsy of Mr. Osei's long game revealed the devastating patience of old money versus the frantic, destructive greed of new money. Serwaa operated on a timeline of immediate gratification, moving fast, breaking things, and using fear as a blunt instrument to secure her desires. Mr. Osei and Ama operated on generational time. They understood that the most effective way to destroy a parasite is to let it gorge itself until it bursts. They had not stopped Serwaa from stealing. They had quietly built a cage out of her own greed, waiting for her to step fully inside and lock the door herself. "Thank you, Uncle," Ama murmured, her fingers closing tightly around the cold plastic of the flash drive. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of your restraint," Mr. Osei said, a flicker of deep emotion cracking his professional facade. He looked at the harsh, miserable conditions of the room, the raw blisters on Ama's hands. "You have endured hell to save his legacy." "Hell is merely a location, Uncle," Ama replied, her jaw locked in absolute certainty. "Tomorrow night, I am giving it a new occupant. The week leading up to the Stakeholders Gala was a masterclass in silent accumulation." Ama moved through the mansion like a shadow cast by the impending execution. She watched Serwaa berate the florists, terrorize the catering staff, and try on 3 different bespoke gowns, entirely consumed by the vanity of her own reflection. Ama documented every insult, every squandered cedi, every moment of unearned arrogance. She did not speak. She did not react. She simply collected the data, feeding the internal furnace of her composure. On the morning of the gala, the atmosphere in the house reached a fever pitch of chaotic preparation. The massive ballroom, usually closed off, was thrown open. Tables draped in black velvet and gold silk were arranged in concentric circles. Ice sculptures depicting cocoa pods rested on silver pedestals, slowly dripping onto the polished floors. The smell of roasting meats, imported truffles, and excessive floral arrangements created a heavy, intoxicating perfume of extreme wealth. Serwaa stood in the center of the chaos, a walkie-talkie in her hand, barking orders at a terrified event planner. Kwame was nowhere to be seen, having retreated to his study with a bottle of scotch, unable to face the hundreds of shareholders he was actively betraying. "Ama," Serwaa snapped, her voice cutting through the hum of the preparations like a serrated blade. Ama stepped forward, her hands folded neatly at her waist. She wore the standard uniform of the serving staff, a stiff black dress with a stark white collar, her hair pulled back severely beneath a plain cloth wrap. "You will be assigned to the VIP tables near the podium," Serwaa instructed, her eyes raking over Ama's modest appearance with obvious distaste. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact with the board members. You are there to refill the champagne and remove the empty plates. If you embarrass me, you will not have a bed to sleep in tomorrow night." "I understand my role perfectly, madam," Ama replied. Her voice was conversational, betraying absolutely nothing. The psychological autopsy of this final interaction before the climax highlighted the profound danger of underestimating an opponent who has nothing left to lose. Serwaa looked at Ama and saw a defeated, broken woman clinging to the bottom rung of the socio-economic ladder. She saw the uniform and assumed it dictated the intellect and the power of the wearer. She failed to recognize the absolute, glacial stillness in Ama's eyes, the look of a predator that has already felt its jaws close around the neck of its prey. As the sun began to set over the sprawling coastal city of Accra, casting long, bloody shadows across the manicured lawns of the cantonment's estate, the trap was fully armed. The offshore accounts were primed for the freeze. The high court documents were stamped. The guests were beginning to arrive in a parade of luxury vehicles, their headlights cutting through the descending darkness. Ama stood in the shadows of the catering corridor, holding a silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne. The heavy bass of the Afrobeat orchestra began to thump through the floorboards, a rhythmic, somatic pulse that mirrored her own heartbeat. She did not feel anxiety. She did not feel the need to practice her speech. She simply stood in the quiet dark, listening to the laughter of the elite spilling into the grand hall, waiting for the precise moment to tear the entire empire down to its foundations. The long, agonizing season of silent reclamation was over. The harvest was ready. The Stakeholders Gala of the Gold Coast Cocoa Empire was a monument to excessive, insulated wealth. The grand ballroom of the cantonment's estate had been transformed into an immersive theater of corporate dominance. The air conditioning was set so low that women draped in imported Italian silk shivered slightly, their diamond necklaces catching the refracted light of 3 massive crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of roasted guinea fowl, black truffles flown in from France, and the sharp, floral notes of expensive vintage champagne. A 10-piece high-life orchestra played on a raised mahogany stage, the brass instruments gleaming under the spotlights, producing a wall of sound designed to drown out any conversation that did not revolve around profit margins and market expansion. Amma moved through this curated paradise like a phantom. The stark black and white of her servant's uniform rendered her socially invisible to the guests. She carried a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal flutes, navigating the labyrinth of power brokers, government ministers, and foreign investors. She observed the texture of their lives, the unbroken glass, the cold silver cutlery, the pressed linen napkins, and contrasted it with the memory of the jagged cocoa beans, the mud, and the suffocating heat of the processing shed. She existed simultaneously in both realities, a living bridge between the dirt that built the empire and the champagne that celebrated it. Her jaw remained locked. Her breathing was a slow, metered rhythm. She poured drinks for men who owned half the city, men who looked right through her, unaware that the woman filling their glasses held the power to liquidate their portfolios before the night was over. At exactly 9 o'clock, the orchestra brought their lively set to a smooth, orchestrated close. A single spotlight cut through the ambient amber glow of the room, illuminating the center of the stage. Serwaa stepped into the light. She was breathtaking in her arrogance, draped in a custom emerald green gown that swept the polished floor, a necklace of rare yellow diamonds resting heavily against her collarbone. She approached the microphone with the measured, predatory grace of a woman who believed she had conquered the world. To her right, seated at the primary VIP table, was Kwame. He looked like a beautifully tailored corpse. His complexion was ashen, his hands folded tightly in his lap to hide their relentless trembling. Beside him sat Mr. Osei, the senior corporate counsel, his weathered face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. Honored guests, esteemed board members, and partners in our great enterprise, Serwaa began, her voice amplified, smooth, and laced with absolute confidence. Tonight is not merely a celebration of our annual yields. Tonight marks a profound transition in the history of Gold Coast Cocoa. We are streamlining our operations. We are eliminating the obsolete structures of the past, and we are moving forward into an era of unprecedented, singular leadership. She paused, allowing the applause to roll through the room. She drank in the adulation, her chest expanding, her vanity fed by the clapping hands of the wealthiest individuals in the region. The psychological autopsy of Serwaa's speech laid bare the ultimate delusion of the usurper. She spoke of the future, entirely ignorant of the fact that her timeline had already expired. She used the collective we, but every person in the room understood that she was declaring an absolute dictatorship. She believed that standing on a stage equated to legitimate authority, mistaking the spotlight for actual structural power. It is a fatal error to believe that applause is a substitute for ownership. Serwaa was not a queen addressing her subjects. She was a trespasser standing on a trap door. Before we raise our glasses to this new future, Serwaa continued, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto the back corner, exactly where she had ordered Amma to stand. A cruel, vindictive smile played across her lips. Even in her moment of supposed total victory, she could not resist the urge to execute one final, petty humiliation. I would like to propose A very special toast. Ama, bring the reserve champagne to the head table. Now, the entire ballroom turned to look. Hundreds of eyes shifted from the radiant woman on the stage to the lowly servant standing in the shadows. The social dynamic was brutally clear, the monarch summoning the peasant to serve as a visual prop of her dominance. Ama did not hesitate. She gripped the edges of the silver tray. Her heartbeat moved into her ears, a slow, powerful drumbeat. She walked forward. The distance between the shadow and the stage was exactly 42 steps. She took them with glacial precision. Her back was perfectly straight. She did not look at the floor. She looked directly at Serwaa. As Ama reached the VIP table, placing the tray gently onto the linen tablecloth, Mr. Osei stood up. He did not reach for a glass. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit and withdrew a thick, sealed document adorned with the red wax crest of the High Court of Accra. He did not hand it to Kwame. He handed it to the head of the corporate board, a severe-looking man sitting directly across the table. "There will be no toast," Mr. Osei said. He did not use a microphone, but his gravelly baritone cut through the ambient noise of the room with the force of a physical blow. The offshore transfers executed this afternoon by Serwaa Obuasi have officially triggered the embezzlement and hostile usurpation clauses of the founder's original irrevocable trust. The transition from the fluid, descriptive prose of the build-up into the sharp, fragmented reality of the climax began immediately. The syntax fractured. The world broke apart. The conversation at the long tables stopped. The pianist, halfway through a soft transitional chord, lifted his hands from the keys. A waiter carrying a stack of porcelain plates froze in the center of the aisle. The heavy silence of the room descended not with politeness, but with the terrifying gravity of a collapsing building. It was the silence of 100 apex predators simultaneously realizing they were trapped in a cage. Serwaa suffered a total physiological collapse. The color left her face the way light leaves a room when someone throws a switch. Her hand, resting elegantly on the microphone stand, dropped to her side like a dead weight. Her mouth opened, her jaw unhinged slightly. No sound emerged. The architecture of her reality evaporated in a single second. At the table, the enablers broke. Kwame's crystal water goblet slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering against the edge of the table and spilling ice across his tailored trousers. He slumped forward, gripping the edge of the mahogany as if the floor had suddenly turned to liquid. The head of the corporate board scrambled backward, his heavy wooden chair screeching violently against the marble floor. Two sycophantic junior executives seated nearby physically recoiled, dropping their napkins and staring at Mr. Osei in absolute, unshielded horror. Ama did not move. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She stood behind the silver tray, her hands folded neatly at her waist. She had waited 11 months for this silence. She was not going to interrupt it. The trust dictates an immediate, non-negotiable transfer of all executive power, voting rights, and asset control, Mr. Osei continued, his voice ringing out in the dead quiet of the ballroom. Kwame Obuasi's proxy is permanently revoked. Serwaa Obuasi is entirely divested of all corporate authority and marital financial privileges, effective 30 minutes ago. Mr. Osei turned slowly. He bypassed Kwame. He bypassed Serwaa on the stage. He looked directly at the woman in the servant's uniform. "The empire reverts to the sole designated blood heir," Mr. Osei declared. "Ama Obiora." The shockwave completed its final ripple. The board members stared. Serwaa's eyes darted wildly, her mind refusing to process the linguistic impossibility of the lawyer's words. The servant was the heir. The woman who had scrubbed the courtyard was the owner of the walls. "This is a lie," Serwaa gasped, her voice a thin, reedy squeak that barely carried past the first row of tables. Her chest heaved. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Ama. "She is a maid. She is a nobody. Arrest her. Mr. Osei, you are fired. Kwame, say something." Kwame could not speak. He could not look at his wife. He stared at the shattered glass in his lap, the physical manifestation of his ruined life. Amma stepped out from behind the VIP table. She did not rush. She walked up the 3 short stairs to the stage. She stopped exactly 2 feet from Serwaa. The height difference was negligible, but the gravitational pull of power had shifted so violently that Serwaa seemed to shrink inward, her emerald gown suddenly looking like a costume on a terrified child. "I know," Amma said. Her voice was conversational, low, and terrifyingly calm. "You know what?" Serwaa hissed, a frantic animal panic bleeding from her pores. "I know you thought silence was surrender," Amma replied, her dark eyes locking onto Serwaa's terrified gaze. "I know you thought poverty was a personality trait. You built a kingdom on the assumption that the people sweeping your floors could not read your ledgers. That is what I expected you to do." Serwaa stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of the microphone stand. She caught herself, her breathing ragged, the scent of her expensive perfume soured by the sharp, undeniable odor of pure, unadulterated terror. "You have nothing," Serwaa spat, though the words lacked any structural integrity. "I am his wife. I am the face of this company. You are a trespasser," Amma corrected softly. She did not raise her voice. She delivered the judgment with the clinical precision of a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb. "Your offshore accounts in the Seychelles were frozen at 8:45 this evening. Your access codes to the cantonment's estate have been digitally revoked. The diamond necklace you are currently wearing is catalogued as a corporate asset of Gold Coast Cocoa. You will take it off, you will leave it on the tray." The psychological autopsy of Serwaa's destruction was absolute. She was not merely losing her wealth, she was losing the only metric by which she measured her own humanity. Without the money, she was a void. She reached up with trembling hands, her fingers fumbling blindly with the complicated clasp of the necklace. The diamonds, heavy and cold, slid from her neck and pooled into her palm. She dropped them onto Amma's silver tray. The metallic clatter echoed through the silent ballroom like a final, definitive death knell. Amma turned her gaze to Kwame. He was still seated, a broken, hollow vessel. "You traded your son for a title you did not even own," Amma said to him, her voice devoid of pity. "You watched him bleed on the raw beans. You signed the papers to send him to Tamale. You thought cowardice was a survival strategy. You will vacate the premises by midnight. You will not contact Yaw. If you attempt to access any corporate funds, Mr. Osei will release the unredacted files of your embezzlement to the authorities." Kwame nodded slowly, a pathetic, jerky motion. He had no defense. He had no soul left to defend. The doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open. 4 uniformed officers of the Ghana Police Service entered, their presence requested hours ago by Mr. Place Osei to execute the financial warrants regarding Serwaa's offshore fraud. "You should sit down, Serwaa," Amma said, offering her signature phrase one final time. "The authorities have questions about the transport subsidiary." Serwaa's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the polished wooden stage, her emerald gown pooling around her like spilled toxic waste. She covered her face with her hands, a harsh, jagged sob tearing from her throat. It was the sound of a woman realizing that the universe possesses a terrifying mechanism for justice, and that it had been quietly operating in her own kitchen for 11 months. Amma did not stay to watch the officers read Serwaa her rights. She did not say to accept the stunned apologies of the corporate board. She turned her back on the stage, walked down the steps, and exited the ballroom. The heavy oak doors sealed behind her, shutting out the noise, the wealth, and the ruin. 3 days later, the Harmattan wind finally broke. A light, unseasonable rain fell over the northern city of Tamale, washing the dust from the iron gates of the St. Jude Disciplinary Academy. Amma stood in the administrative office. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, her hair braided in intricate, regal patterns. The headmaster, a severe man who had built a career on breaking children, reviewed the heavily stamped legal documents Amma placed on his desk with trembling hands. He recognized the seal of the High Court. He recognized the name of the new CEO of the Gold Coast Cocoa Empire. 5 minutes later, the heavy wooden door of the office opened. Yaw stepped inside. He wore a stiff, scratchy uniform. His head was shaved. He looked smaller, his eyes guarded and deeply weary. He saw Amma. He stopped. He did not look for permission from the headmaster. He did not look for his father. He ran across the room and buried his face into the fabric of Amma's suit. "It has not been 21 days, Auntie Amma," he whispered, his small hands gripping her jacket with desperate, profound strength. "The shadows burned away faster than I calculated, my brave boy," Amma murmured, resting her hand on the back of his head. "We are going home, and it is actually our home now." The moral of the story is not that wealth solves all problems, nor is it that the suffering of the righteous is a down payment on future luxury. The moral is that dignity is an internal architecture that cannot be dismantled by external cruelty. Poverty is a circumstance. Character is a sovereign state. Serwaa believed that money gave her the right to destroy the vulnerable. She failed to understand that money is merely a magnifying glass. It takes whatever is inside a person and projects it onto the walls of their life. It projected Serwaa's rot, just as surely as it projected Amma's unyielding restraint. True power is not the ability to force a child to kneel in the rain. True power is the ability to kneel in the rain yourself, knowing absolutely that you own the sky. If this story reached you, share it with one woman in your life who needs to hear it. Not for me, for her. Because every woman you know is carrying a story she has never told. And somewhere in this one, maybe you heard the beginning of hers. Subscribe only if you intend to stay. This channel is not for passing traffic. It is for women who know that patience is a weapon, silence is a strategy, and the truth, given enough time, always finds the door.